It's a joy to get to introduce Marcus Winchester, who is the Language and Culture Director of the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi. Those of you who joined us last night may have noticed him honoring us at the drum and with his singing. Winchester is a gifted thinker, a creative advocate for his community, and though ever a Michigan State fan, he finds himself increasingly working on events like this one at Notre Dame. His good work on the planning committee for this meeting helped to ensure that the arrival of our dancers, our singers, and allowed for us to have our smudging. Winchester is a caring and involved parent, an infinitely kind and patient man as he encounters those of us who are not from Indian country, all the while working to protect his people's language and culture and help educate the broader world about the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi. Please join me in welcoming Marcus Winchester.
Mano Wabin. That means good morning. Bonjour and Denway Magnaduk, Marcus Winchester, Indigenous Bodéwadmik, Mino, Dawa and Daw, Jigwe and Dodam, Cowater, Michigan, Doch Bia, Mina, Bawa Ting, Ndada, Odopi. So what I just said was hello. No, I'm just kidding. I said way more than hello. So I just introduced myself with a basic introduction in Potawatomi. First I said that my name was Marcus Winchester. I come from the Potawatomi and Odawa nations of Great Lakes. And I said that I was Thunder Clan. And so in Potawatomi way, the clan system determines your role in the community, your jobs, your responsibilities to the people, to the nation. And so mine is that of the Thunder Clan. Then I said that I was from Coldwater, Michigan. That's where I was raised. And after graduating high school, I went off to school. And after that, I came back to work for my people. And I currently live about 20 minutes north of here in Niles, Michigan. And I called it Bawa Ting. And so that means like place of the rapids. So the St. Joseph River, where the university was founded along, in our language we call that Sanajwa Zibe. And what that refers to is a rough or difficult current. And so the St. Joe River before, the way it looks now, it used to be a lot shallower. It used to be way more rough. But then they dammed it up, dredged it here and there, and did all the different things they did to it. And now it's the river that you know today. But that's why the Potawatomi people used to call it what we did, is because it was a lot shallower and a lot more difficult to travel on. And I guess in particularly around the Niles area, it was pretty rough, and that's why they called it Bawa Ting. So I'm here just to give a quick little introduction about the Potawatomi people, some of the teachings that we have, and how it pertains to the larger message, the larger issue that we're talking about here with this conference, with everybody being here. So what makes most sense to talk about right now are the 7th generation prophecies, or the 7th generation teachings. I think nations all over Turtle Island, North America, have different variations of the 7th generation teachings. I've heard a couple of different varieties just around here in the different lodges that we have around here in my own lifetime. But I think they all pretty much talk about the same thing or get down to the same idea. A couple of the ones that I know of have to deal with the idea that our old ones, our ancestors knew. They had received the prophecy that indigenous peoples of this earth were going to go through a really hard, tough time. We would almost not make it. We would almost come to see a day when our way of life would become extinct, and we would almost be there. We would be like on the edge of the cliff. But then the 7th generation would come, right after that was to take place, in the 7th generation, they would come back in full force, and they would be proud to be who they are, and they would want to learn the language and learn the teachings and bring all of that back. So that's one of the 7th generation teachings that I've heard, and some would argue that that took place the late 1800s, the entire 1800s, with what happened here in North America, where our culture was almost wiped out, and then come into the mid-1900s as a result of a variety of different things, but in culmination with the civil rights era, our young ones, the people who were my age in the 50s, 60s, 70s, brought our language and our culture in full force back. So that was the prophecy coming true. There's another variety to the 7th generation teachings that I've heard, and that referred to the idea that when that 7th generation of people did bring those old ways back, the rest of the world would take note, and the rest of the world would notice. The world, we would find ourselves in a place where we had destroyed everything. People were not treating each other very kindly, and there was just a lot of nasty things going around in this world that none of us would deem as good or the way that we should be living. And there would come a time when the world would wake up to this, and they would realize that the indigenous peoples of this world, they knew what they were doing. They had it going on. They had that knowledge and the way to go about living with the earth, and then how that transcends into how we treat one another. And the world would wake up, and they would realize this, and they would come back to those indigenous-based teachings that are focused on living with the earth. And that even goes into the teachings that we have about ourselves, that there's four races, or four races of the earth, of mankind. And the red people of the Americas, we were put here to keep that knowledge intact. And that was one of our main purposes to this Mother Earth. And then, of course, the other twist to the 7th generation teachings has to deal with always thinking 7 generations ahead. And so our old ones tell us that the things that we enjoy today, the things that we're able to take advantage of today, is a direct result of a decision that somebody made 7 generations ago. They were thinking of us 7 generations ago. They wanted for us to have a good home. They wanted us to have a good way of life. And so our ancestors, many generations ago, they were always thinking of us, me, you, everybody in here. They were thinking of us today and what kind of world that they could provide us. And so they were constantly thinking 7 generations ahead. And we need to pay that forward, and we ourselves need to continue thinking 7 generations ahead. Think about our kids, our children's children, their children, so on and so forth, and make sure that we leave a good home for them. And so we need to think 7 generations ahead as well. And so those are just a couple of different variations of the 7th generation teachings that I've heard growing up, different lodge teachings, but they all pertain to the same thing. They all come to that same idea of returning to the knowledge that our ancestors gave us, returning to those old ways, because we belong to the earth. The earth doesn't belong to us. And a lot of people, they don't want to go with that idea of returning to indigenous knowledge, or like I just said, the old ways. I know it was a big distinction throughout the 1960s, 1970s in Indian country between traditional Indians and modern Indians. It would almost be kind of like a derogatory slang to tell the traditional Indians that they wanted to go back to the blanket or back to the teepee, and it was meant to be like a jab. But that type of thinking rests on one fundamental misconception, that things that are old aren't sophisticated and things that are contemporary are. And that's not necessarily the truth. Just because something's around and was invented in 2016 doesn't mean that it's more efficient or better than something that was invented in 1816. And going along with that, the idea of traditional, I think, gets a bad reputation as well. A lot of the things that people think of as traditional, they mistake for nostalgia or antiquity. The things that we deem as traditional, we don't cherish and hold dear to our hearts and honor because of how important they were 2 centuries ago, but we pick and honor those things because of what they mean to us today. And so going back to traditional teachings doesn't mean that we're going in reverse, but rather that we're moving forward with the foundation of that traditional knowledge that our ancestors had. And so the history of my tribe is kind of almost a culmination of this idea of moving forward with technology, modern technology as a tool, and using our traditional teachings as the foundation to move forward in a good way. In the early 1800s, the leaders from the Potawatomi, if you look in any history books, we're not called the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi. We're either called the St. Joseph Potawatomi or the Catholic Potawatomi. And that's because the Potawatomi villages along the St. Joseph River in the early 1800s welcomed they welcomed a missionary into their area as a part of treaty negotiations, and that was what they wanted to do in reaction to American expansion. Rather than fight Americans or try to resist Americans, the Potawatomi along the St. Joseph decided to welcome them and therefore overall have influence over American expansion rather than trying to fight it. And so their tactic was to invite a missionary into the village. The first missionary that they invited wasn't very successful. Unfortunately, he pocketed a lot of the money that was guaranteed to the Potawatomi by the United States government, and a lot of the things that he promised just weren't delivered. And so our leaders put their heads together again, decided that they didn't like that had come, and so one of our leaders, Leopold Pokagon, traveled to Detroit, Michigan, to the Catholic diocese and asked Father Gabriel Richard if he could send a Catholic missionary. At first, Father Richard, he didn't want to send anybody. He didn't want to get in the middle of the missionary that was already down here, and he didn't want any part of it. And then the old story goes is that Leopold dropped to his knees and started reciting prayers. And when the interpreter finally interpreted what Leopold was saying, it blew Father Richard away because he was reciting old Catholic prayers that the Potawatomi had learned from the French during the fur trade. And as soon as that happened, Father Richard said, "You know what? That you got it. We're going to send you a missionary." And so they sent somebody by the name of Father Baden, and he set up an extremely successful mission in Pokagon's village. And they did just what these seventh generations talk about. They used contemporary technology with traditional teachings as a foundation to move forward in a good way. The Potawatomi people along the St. Joseph River built cabins. They started learning European techniques for farming. They had European livestock. They were learning how to do blacksmith trades and sewing, European style, and all these different things. And so when American Indian removal was signed into law and it came time to do more treaty negotiations with the Potawatomi, Leopold stood up at the Chicago Treaty, and he said, you know, all the reasons why you want us to be removed east of the Mississippi don't apply to us. You want to remove us because you said we're incapable of living by a side with Americans, that we're savages, we don't know how to farm, we can't learn how to read and write. Well, my village is doing that, and it's very successful. And that's when the American government said, you know what, you're right, you guys don't have to leave. And right in the treaty, it says that Pokagon and his Potawatomi are allowed to stay based on their religious creed. And so here you have a great example of how the Potawatomi people knew about this seventh generation teachings, and they knew that the key to the future was combining and using modern technology with our indigenous teachings as the foundation, as the base, as a positive way to move forward. And so eventually that missionary that Leopold welcomed into his community, Father Baden, he left, but his replacement came in, and Father Baden made his replacement promise him that he would continue his Indian mission, that he would continue working with the Potawatomi people, and his replacement promised him that he would. His replacement ended up being Father Soren, who goes down as the founder of Notre Dame. And Father Soren came here, and Notre Dame has its roots as a mission, as a school for the Potawatomi people of the St. Joseph River. And eventually, over time, the Potawatomi helped Father Soren build up the school, start welcoming more Catholic people, Catholic settlers that were in the area, and eventually Notre Dame grew to this great, beautiful place that we know it is today. But I think that's a good way to tie in the theme here, what we're talking about here, and how it really hits home right here in South Bend, Indiana on Notre Dame's campus. This is the homeland of the Potawatomi people, the Bodéwadmik. Today we have the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi that live about half hour, 45 minutes north of here in Dowagiac, Michigan. That's where we're headquartered. We also have communities in Hartford, Michigan, and South Bend, Indiana as well. And we're here because our ancestors tapped into this idea that we're talking about today. It worked for us, it was successful for us, and that's why we're still here. And that's why we're going to continue to be here for the next 7th generations. And now you know the short, well, it's not a short history, but you know how the Potawatomi people in this university here are related. The whole reason why the university is here is because of the Potawatomi people. And so we look forward to the coming weeks and the different teachings that everybody has to share and offer. And I hope everybody has a really good time. And so with that, miigwech for listening to me ramble on this morning. Aha, bamapi.
Marcus is willing, we have time for just a couple of questions. You can do those when you see if you want your microphones on. And your microphones are on as well. So.
Yes, thanks, Marcus. Right here. Hi. So when you saw the slide up here with 2 worldviews and this distinction that was made and characteristics of one and the other on the other side, do you have a response to that, and do you have a nuance to that or anything that you'd like to?
Thank you for the question. I think the slide hit spot on. I actually have a similar different slide that I do with our new hires. When we have new hires come into the tribe, they all go through a week-long orientation of 1 hour out of their day each day. Somebody from the language and culture department comes in and does either history, language or cultural sensitivity. And that cultural sensitivity day, I put up a slide, and it's almost identical to the slide that Darsha put up. And it hits the nail on the head. I remember reading one article when I was an undergrad, and it said that the single biggest difference between indigenous people and non-indigenous people is that indigenous people believe that they're one with the earth, I guess, whereas the other worldview is dominant over earth. I think it was, I definitely relate with that slide. Thank you.
Notre Dame students, how many of you knew this was a Potawatomi place? Yeah, we just have to show hands. Okay, a couple. Great, thanks.
Over here.
Marcus, my name's Jeff Nixon. I'm from South Bend here. I don't know much at all about the Pokagon Band. I've spent several summers volunteering way out west with the Lakota people on Pine Ridge. One area of history I've struggled to learn about, and it's the people here before out there, the Lakota, or the people in this area before the Pokagon. Do you know much about that, or can you? My sense is all the tribes had to make march westward because of American expansion. It can be kind of a delicate issue, I sense, with some tribes as to whose land is the homeland, even among some Indian. I'm just authentically curious about that for this area.
The story that's coming to mind for me right now, I guess it's popping up because of the conference. So I guess that's what I'll share. But our origin story is that we came from the East Coast, that we migrated here after receiving prophecies that we needed to migrate west. That's one of the most commonly accepted stories amongst the Anishinaabe people. And so Anishinaabe refers to Bodéwadmik, Potawatomi, Odawa or Ottawa, and Ojibwe or Chippewa. So the three of us, we call ourselves Anishinaabe, which means the human. And one of the, like I said, most widely accepted stories amongst the three of us is that we came from the East Coast. And before we got here to this area, there's people that built a lot of mounds, a lot of earth structures. They're scattered all throughout southern Michigan, southern Wisconsin, northern Indiana, northern Ohio, so forth. But the story that's coming to mind right now is the teaching that I heard one time that before this current generation that we're in, or civilization, I guess you could say, this current world that we're in, there were 4 others previous to us. It was either 3 or 4, I can't remember right now, but they came before we did, and they had their rise and then they had their fall, and so that I always interpreted that as, and sometimes archaeologists or anthropologists, they agree with this as well, is that those people who worked the earth, those mound builders, the ones that did all that, they had lived a life, and they were living a life that ended up being unsustainable. They had huge, large populaces. They had populations that would rival anything in Europe or Africa at the same exact time in history. And they just got to a point where they could no longer live there because they had depleted all the natural resources, and so they had to split back up into villages. They had to abandon these city centers and go back to living the village lifestyle. And that happened 3 or 4 times before the current one that we're in. So we were supposed to learn from those previous people, those previous worlds, and that's why the indigenous people of North America this time around are trying to stick and hold on to our teachings rather than let them go. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that was the story that came to my mind.
Thank you very much, yes.
Yes.
I'm from Omaha. And directly east of us, in Iowa, we have Potawatomi County. Tell me how that happened.
Yep, certainly. So Potawatomi homeland was all of southern Michigan, all of northern Indiana, all of northern Ohio, a good chunk of northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin on up in the Green Bay. That was traditional Potawatomi homeland. When removal came, the Potawatomi reacted to removal differently. Everybody reacted to it differently. Some escaped into Canada and hid out in Canada. Some tried to avoid it and were forcibly removed. Some were like us, the Potawatomi in this area, who welcomed in American influence and ended up using it as a way to stay here. Some people hid out in Wisconsin, and they're still there to this day. But some people actually willingly left as well because they didn't want to have anything to do with Americans. So the people who, that on their way out west, first they were moved to like Missouri, and then they were moved to Iowa, and then they eventually ended up in Kansas. It might have been Iowa, then Missouri, but that I know that they were in Missouri, they were in Iowa before they ended up in Kansas. And so those Potawatomi, they had either voluntarily left because the government promised them money and goods, or they had been forcibly removed. And so that's why there's probably that Potawatomi County in Iowa, because I imagine they were probably there for a year or two on their way out west.
If I could add to that answer, which is correct, I studied Potawatomi history in Kansas, and the tribe was removed, as he accurately stated. There are different bands of Potawatomi, so there's the Citizen Band, which is in Oklahoma, the Prairie Band, which is in Kansas, Pokagon, and there's one in Wisconsin as well as some remnants in the Canadian area. But they were forcibly removed by the government in Thomas Jefferson's Indian Removal Act. One group was moved through Missouri and into Missouri, but then they ended up in eastern Kansas, and the other group went through Missouri and ended up in Council Bluffs, Iowa. So Potawatomi County is right on the other side of Omaha, on the Omaha, Nebraska, Iowa border. So that's why the county was named there, Potawatomi County, because that was their reserve before. It was their reserve for about 5 years before another treaty was forced upon them, and the Prairie Band was moved to Kansas, central Kansas, just northwest of Topeka. And then, of course, there was another removal to Oklahoma. So it's a complicated history, but pretty much a result of a series of treaties that forced them to cede land in every state between here and Oklahoma.
Regrets for adding that. We had a question over here.
Yes, when you were speaking earlier, you used the term Turtle Island, and over the years I've heard lots of definitions of the word turtle, or the term turtle island means to the pagans.
Sure, I'll answer that. And so everything I say here is my own story, I guess you could say. There's tons of different nations out there, and within every nation, there's many different teachings, many different teachers, and so I'm just one individual. But as far as Turtle Island goes, to my understanding, that's in relation to, at one time the entire earth was flooded, and when the animals got together and were trying to think of what they were going to do, what they were going to do about it, the turtle sacrificed his back, he sacrificed his shell, and said, if somebody can go down to the bottom of the ocean here and pick up a piece of earth and bring it back up, you can use my turtle shell back as a place for the earth to start to grow again. And so that's how that happened. Eventually, an animal brought back up a piece of earth, rested it on the turtle's back, and the earth grew. Long story short, there's more to it right here. Thank you.
Hi, Marcus. Thanks for your talk and for the warm welcome in us. I have a question. It's kind of a follow-up question to the one you received a few minutes ago about the two worldviews. And it's clear that accommodation or assimilation as a tactic to gain homeland is really powerful, and that's really important. But I also think that there's some real tension between adopting the worldview and the ways of life of a society, of an invading society, the colonizers who've brought extraordinarily destructive practices upon the lands that we love. So can you speak to that tension and about, because what I hear is still a very much a celebratory position on the decision to accommodate to white ways. And so I just want to hear your comment on that.
I always try to spin it because if you read any books about Pokagon Potawatomi, they'll always try to say it like the Americans let the Potawatomi stay. They assimilated to Catholicism, and so therefore the Americans were more willing to put up with the Potawatomi because of that, and that's why they were allowed to stay. And I always look at it the other way, because we learned and took on different American lifestyles. The Americans weren't the ones putting up with us, we were the ones putting up with the Americans. And so when we learned those things, it made it easier for us to get along with them, you know, kind of rather than the other way of looking around at it. And I think that tension is definitely there. All the families within our communities responded and reacted to it differently. It's definitely a true example of the idea of walking two different worlds. I think this tribe is a really good example of that. We have a lot of families who have held on very strong to the traditions. We have a lot of families who let it go, and it hasn't been very active for many different generations. But in today's time, I think it all worked itself out, and people are identifying for themselves which aspects of the two different worldviews they pick and choose from in order to live those lives today. But as far as, you know, the tension, the worldview tension, and walking two different worlds, it's definitely there, and we're trying to figure it out. And I think the decisions that our ancestors made and the direction that our tribe has went and the success that our community has is a good example of how that tension, the energy from that tension can be used for positive things in the community. That answer your question, kind of?